So yeah, as I said, it's really an honor to be here and to finally join forces in the construction of an alternative vision for circularity and build together, um, from circular economy something more transformative, more holistic, possibly. So my presentation will take you through the history and kind of diversity of circularity visions that exist and have existed through history. It's research that we've been doing here at Utrecht University as part of the Cresting project, some of which other members presented, such as Estefania and Natasha during earlier days in today's forum. It's a research that I'm conducting with also my supervisor, Walter Vermeulen, and Roberta Salomoni. First of all, circular economy, as everybody knows, probably don't have to repeat what it means, but it's clear that the concept has gone and risen in attention enormously in the last time, and especially now it's been seen as kind of a solution to a lot of socio-ecological problems of the 21st century. It is said that through circular policies and innovations, we can really tackle resource scarcity, climate change, food scarcity, environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, and even unemployment and economic stagnation. I mean, this is why the circular economy is at the head of the EU recovery program, and it's really everywhere now. It's hard to see even a company or a country that doesn't have a circular plan, policy, or strategy. However, a lot of the claims of circular economy are facing key challenges in order to be realized. And these expectations are very high. There are two core limitations, essentially, that we can speak of regarding circular economy discourses. And those limitations have been actually quite well discussed in this forum already. There's first a lack of social and political dimension, and Kirsty Hobson touched upon this quite well during her presentation yesterday. And essentially what it means is that there's little discussion of who owns circular innovations and technologies. Is it a few large companies and in a few large and powerful countries, or is it going to be an open source circular society that is accessible to all through technologies that every country can use and that are shared amongst all of humanity? There's also a lack of discussion about the actual governance of the transition, like how and who is sitting at the table deciding who's going to pay and who's going to bear the benefits of this transition. And this lack of social and political dimension has key consequences already. For example, when we see the Gilets jaunes protests in France, the ecological transition, where France tried to install higher taxes on fossil fuels, was faced with huge popular unrest because there were no accompanying social measures to reduce a little bit the impact of this on society, and especially the most vulnerable members of society. Similarly, there was little democratic discussion at the time about how to do this transition in a more socially just way. The second point is that it assumes that the possibility of economic decoupling or basically the idea that economic growth can be decoupled from environmental degradation. This is a key assumption behind a lot of circular economy discourses, and Percy has also touched upon this in her lecture, essentially going against all scientific evidence and even against the laws of thermodynamics that tell us that essentially materials degrade every time they're used and cycled through the economy. And obviously energy dissipates and we cannot reuse it eternally. Therefore, the idea of a perfect circular system only works with biological cycles and cannot operate obviously in an industrial, capitalist, productive, growing economy as we have now. Therefore, if we think about a fully circular society, we also have to think beyond growth. Otherwise, we're replicating fallacies and illusions. Now, this deliberately vague and uncontroversial discourse of circular economy that is right now the mainstream kind of version of circular economy has gained widespread support because it's easy. It's easy to promote, and it doesn't have, key kind of dirty questions that have to be addressed regarding redistribution or systemic limits of the capitalist system in which we are all. Therefore, it is often used as a kind of narrative device for greenwashing, to foster an illusion that we can continue growing on forever, just need to add a few circular technologies and innovations here and there, and things will be fine. However, obviously, there's a big problem with this, and circularity discourses have not always been so depoliticized. If we look at the long history and diversity of circular economy propositions and circularity ideas through time, we see a much more holistic picture. So let me take you just through a quick historic overview of circularity ideas through time. So circularity really is nothing new. And to be fair, it started at the beginning of humankind in 300,000 BC. We were all living in circular societies. We were living in total symbiosis with the biosphere, and we never overshot its boundaries until much later on in the last 200 years when the Industrial Revolution and industrial capitalism started growing. And obviously, this has led to the overuse of fossil fuels, the overdestruction of biodiversity, and etc. And the corresponding writings and books and theories regarding circularity started to rise at the same time. Perhaps it is worth noting here in the Gandhian economics in 1945, as early as then, already proposing an economy of permanence. The economics of the coming spaceship Earth by Boulding, which is often seen as one of the precursors of the circular economy, seeking a spaceman economy, where we understand the Earth as a spaceship in which we are all equal inhabitants, or rather passengers. One of the most important books, however, in this time period, which is of the 70s, where there's a plurality of just very transformative visions happening, is The Closing Circle by Barry Commoner. He's the first one, perhaps, to have used this idea or this vision of a circle, this metaphor of a circle, propose a sustainable society. And he builds upon the ecological kind of depths of the theories that rose in his time, and also adds a lot of socialist ideas to create a vision of a future that is harmonious both with nature but also within society and socially just and fair. During these times, we have many other really interesting theories that come up. There's obviously the report of the limits to growth of Meadows and Al that showed with mathematical models that growth could not operate infinitely in a finite system. And surprisingly enough, the models and the that they had developed back then and all the predictions that they have found remain valid to date. And we're following essentially the path to catastrophe that they had envisioned or they had plotted back then. There's also really interesting books that are worth mentioning here, such as Small is Beautiful by Schumacher, which is inspired by Buddhist economics to create a harmonious alternative society. And of course, The Steady State Economics in 1977 by Herman Daly, which was a foundational book in ecological economics. Now, this period of a wealth of different theories was also a moment where other less socially inclusive theories were born, such as the population bomb and overshoot. Now, these theories do include a very strong analysis of the current limits of the system, but however do not include many social elements, and therefore focus on population rather than the actual system as a place of change. All right. Now, after this moment in the 70s of really a wealth of alternatives, there is a moment in the 80s and 90s that basically corresponds to the rise of neoliberalism, where a lot of these ideas were translated to more practical industrial terms. With the rise of industrial ecology, industrial metabolism, biomimicry, we see that a lot of market-based solutions are born that try to replicate ecological systems to the industrial world. So using metaphors of ecology and metabolism and applying them to how industries operate, seeking, for example, industries to share waste outputs between one another through processes of industrial symbiosis, and copying, for example, nature's innovations and new technologies So it is a moment of rise in a lot of development of technological thought and industrial development, but that completely doesn't take much care about the systemic nature of the issues, nor the social aspects or democratic political aspects, and rather focuses on the technical aspects. And in 2000s, we see a new period where the social components rise and become important once again. And we have theories like natural capitalism, cradle to cradle, and the blue economy, three core concepts often linked with circularity, and that propose kind of a growth from the industrial ecology of the 80s and 90s, adding a social element. However, they do so in a reformist term and still believe very much that decoupling is possible in this moment. Now, during the 2000s, there is also a parallel rise of another movement, which is much more transformational. And this parallel movement sees and draws inspiration from the 70s rather, and looks at the many theories that were drawn back then, and proposes them nowadays. We see, for example, the degrowth movement rising in 2000 with the publication of Farewell to Growth by Serge Latouche in 2008. There is a rise of eco-socialist movements that propose a whole-scale alternative to the current system. There's also a voluntary simplicity movement led by especially Samuel Alexander's, many books on the topic. We have from the Global South also a myriad and plurality of alternatives that are starting to rise, especially in the later half of 2000s, such as the Buen Vivir from Ecuador and other Andean Latin American countries, but also we have tons and tons of really exciting theories coming from the Global South, and many of them can be regrouped in a term called pluriverse, essentially, which is a world in which many worlds fit, to put simply, and to put in the term coined by the Zapatista movement. So we have there, of course, Ubuntu and Taoist ecology and many, many more concepts that arise to create a complete transformation of the system. So we have this is the kind of historical, transformation of the term circularity, but how we organize these concepts. All these different concepts can be organized based on this typology, essentially, based on this matrix. In the one axis, we have their approach to political considerations. Are they holistic or are they segmented? By holistic, I mean, do they include social and political aspects? And by segmented, I mean, do they focus just on ecological and economic considerations alone? And then on the other axis, we have whether they believe in decoupling. Are they optimist or skeptical about the capacity of technology and innovation to enable the decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation? So using this matrix, we have four basic circularity discourses that arise. There's the technocentric circular economy at the top right, essentially theories that believe that decoupling is possible, but they do not include any social elements. And here we have biomimicry and industrial metabolism. Now, the great positive thing about these theories is that since they're very depoliticized, they're very easy to implement. And companies have really embraced these terms and implemented them widely because they include no real challenge to the systemic kind of conditions in which we are. Now, that's also their major limitation. They're not based on a real understanding, systemic understanding of the limits in the planetary system. And obviously, they're socially pretty much uninteresting and don't provide a vision that includes democracy and social justice. And therefore, that's their main limitation. On the top left, we have the reformist circular society discourses. Now, here I use circular society instead of circular economy because these discourses do include society within them. They include social justice considerations within them. And here we see, however, that they're also optimists and they do believe in decoupling, despite, of course, a lot of evidence showing that it's not possible within a finite planet. And we see their ideas like cradle to cradle and natural capitalism, for example. And the great strength of these movements is that they probably provide the most easily compelling vision. It doesn't challenge the systemic conditions of the world in which we are. However, it does include social justice. So it's very easily embraceable ideas. Nevertheless, so they fail in the fact that they do not address the core reality of the system in which we live, that essentially we cannot operate in a finite planet and continue growing forever. And therefore they're systemically invalid. Now, in the bottom left, we have the transformational circular society discourses. These not only include social justice and democratic participation and empowerment, but also, in addition to that, are skeptical about decoupling and know that we cannot decouple economic growth from environmental degradation, and therefore are much more transformative. We have there, for example, the degrowth movement and the buen vivir, and also most of the movements in the 70s could be placed here. Now, that's the big strength of this transformational circular society discourses, is that they are really the only ones that holistically understand both the social implications and the systemic implications of circularity. However, their main limitation is that by being so transformative, they've had a really hard time getting into the mainstream. We can hope, however, that as time goes by, and as the impacts of climate change and biodiversity destruction and, unfortunately, inequalities rise, these movements will get much stronger, because there will be no way to negate the facts that essentially our climate is going crazy. Now at the bottom right, we have a new set of discourses called fortress circular economy discourses. Now, these discourses do understand the systemic limits of the biosphere. However, they do not really embrace social justice or democratic participation. Rather, they are focused on resource security and geopolitical strength. They are mostly focused, for example, on keeping resources for their national for their countries or for their industry, and maintaining the security of provisioning in a planet, obviously, that is limited by a lot of restrictions. So they're already foreseeing a future where resources are scarce, where migration will increase, especially climate-induced migration will increase, and therefore build fortresses around their countries or their regions in order to protect from these shocks. And you can see this, for example, in millionaires buying bunkers in New Zealand already, and trying to create these self-sustaining bubbles in completely, in places of the world. And you also see this in, unfortunately, the European Union and China, that, completely amasses a fortress around itself, protecting itself from the migration induced by climate change, and refuses to share resources with the global south, such as technologies, and including the vaccine technology that we've developed, and now facing huge scarcity in vaccines, not because we don't have enough production capacity, but because a few companies own them. And this is exactly fortress circular economy in action. In books there, we could see, for example, the population bomb or overshoot. And there's a lot of reports by, large agencies such as the Pentagon that replicate this kind of discourse as well. All right. So essentially, what are we faced with? What is this world in which we're in? Well, we definitely need a discursive shift. The circular economy, seeks to circulate materials, energy, and resources sustainably within the economy. And that is not enough to create a just vision of a just society that is inclusive and fully democratic. We also need to circulate wealth, power, and technology within society in radically democratic and redistributive forms. We need to think of new types of production that are not only clean and environmentally sustainable, but that are also worker-owned and just, and do not focus on hierarchical capitalist relations of power. We have to think about rethinking our democracies, rethinking the way we envisage our role as citizens, and how democracies are shaped, and adding direct democratic elements to the ways in which we transform and live our lives. And unfortunately, we see that over 80% of circular economy definitions fall in the circular economy type. And however, on the good side, most academic concepts, actually, over 70% of academic concepts that are related to circularity that we have investigated, so more or less over 70, 75 concepts are actually in the circular society discourse type. So basically, despite the fact that through history, there has been many more transformative visions than rather segmented visions, society, industry, and politics has chosen ideas of circular economy rather than circular society as guidelines for transformation. And this says a lot. It says a lot in the sense that it shows a failure of the imagination and a kind of mindset that there is no alternative. This idea that we might have to fight the crisis through technology because there's no way we're going to go beyond capitalism, beyond the systemic necessity for growth. And there's no way we're redistributing wealth and income. Rather, we're growing the economy and redistributing the benefits of growth. Yet this is a fallacious discourse, not only because the biosphere cannot accept it, but because it's not actually redistributing anything at all. Inequalities are rising everywhere, just as much as biodiversity degradation and climate change. Therefore, we have to change the discourse. We have to decolonize the imaginary, as we say, and build a pluriversal imaginary that creates essentially circular literacy, as Melanie greatly put it. We have to be able to think beyond the boundaries of the growth-dependent capitalist system and think about post-capitalist forms of life that do not depend on growth, that can live and redistribute resources in really democratic ways. And I think we will learn more about these different forms of creating value and creating circular literacy in the next presentation by Melanie. So I hand on to her and let's carry on this forum.
Thank you very much for this very, very good talk, Martin. And I'm glad to that I don't have to explain many of the basic aspects and the discourses and different concepts that feed into what we are discussing as circular society at the moment. So I'm Melanie, and I'm currently chair of transdisciplinary sustainability research at TU Berlin, but I'm also a member of the board of the Institute of Social Innovation. And in both functions, I'm doing a lot of research since almost 20 years on social change, transformation, and social innovation, particularly in the context of sustainability research. And I would like to dive into two aspects, or some aspects that I find interesting and important to see or to research more about, to do more practices in the future. And it's just a part of all these different interesting things that you could do in the context of circular society. But yeah, I would like to highlight two aspects. And before I'm doing this, I would like to make some preambles, kind of, that I think are important, because we discussed a lot about circular society this week, but it's still not like a clear concept, and we don't have a very common understanding. So it might be good that I say where I stand and what I think is circular society, or how I work with this term. So what I would like to say in the beginning is that I don't think that circular society is the solution. It is more or less, or I prefer to handle it as a term like sustainable development, which is a tentative term, on the one hand, to describe bundles of values, orientations, practices, networks, and processes that form something we could describe as a circular society. So starting from circular everyday practices that are supposed to be part of a circular society, going to communities of practice, material arrangements, and circular governance. So different layers of society that are connected via bundles of practices and networks. and that form a circular society. So it's a term to describe something and to put brackets around something. But it's also, and that feeds into the description, a normative framework that defines goals, objectives, rules, and some normative foundations that we think, or I think, or the community thinks are important. So here's just one example from one of our publications. There are different others that propose these kind of normative goals. And we say, for example, that accessibility and transparency are an important foundation for a circular society, that it needs to foster democratization, empowerment, and it should nourish collaboration and community building. It should increase the spaces for creativity and social innovativeness. And the last thing that I think is important to notice is that the term circular society can also provide a common ground, like we have maybe in this week in the forum for transdisciplinary collaboration, experimental co-creation, and joint lobbying for a sustainable economic future that is guided by the normative framework of a circular society, and that tries to foster the practices that belong to a circular society. Yesterday we had some, or also in the days before, we often talked about circular is the right adjective here. If we should strive for something that is circular, because a circle always means that you end up where you started, kind of. So there were also the suggestion that we talk about a spiral economy, and we should use the metaphor of a spiral. So maybe it's the spiral society in the end. I try to look at circular society as a tentative term. So maybe some term is better, but at the moment, I think to also nourish and be a critical partner to the debate on circular economy, I think it's good to talk about circular society at the moment. The other preamble is on change. We have also talked a lot about change from the last day, about transformation. And what I find very important is that we also talk about how we think change really happens. So that's what I sometimes miss at, for example, sustainability or transformation conferences, is an exchange about the models of change that influence the perception of social reality and transformation. Since sometimes it's quite astonishing that colleagues from climate research, for example, who work with extremely complex models in their simulations, sometimes have a very linear understanding of how people or communities change. Like, say something like, give them information, then their behavior changes. So a more linear perspective, a mechanistic perspective of how society or people change. And also in policy making, and I think you noticed that already, there's a lot of talk about leverages, mechanisms, and drivers, which also applies some sort of cause and effect thinking. So to make clear where I stand, I'm convinced, and I'm sure that I share this conviction with many of you, is that evolutionary and complexity theory are the most appropriate approach to social reality. So social reality is best described as a highly differentiated, self-organizing and self-transcending system of systems, which doesn't make anything easier. And sometimes it's hard to find the right words to describe the complexity, and particularly in English for me, but it means that, among other things, we do not only have to understand how small systems like our metabolism or the family or a forest or an organization works and organizes and transcends itself, but we also need to embed these dynamics into higher order systems and networks of systems. And that also means that we need to pay attention how different subsystems and systems are coupled and interact, and how the mutual feedback loops work between the systems and inside the systems. Like this very simplified action model here below, that means from a system perspective is that there is no linear connection between cause and effect, between an action and an outcome, because there are many feedback loops and many different reactions that need to be considered, like the famous butterfly theory, and many unintended and invisible effects that should be considered if you take a system perspective. And that is why a transformation is not happening by will, force, or by design, but by process of constant learning, experimentation, and listening to the wisdom of the system, this term wisdom of the system I've stolen from Donella Meadows, who wrote a wonderful book about systemic thinking. And she has a lot of interesting guidelines how we can learn to think in systems and how we can learn to listen to systems. So even if we did a visioning workshop on Monday and a road mapping workshop later today, this is not to design a certain future and to really clear about the next concrete steps towards it, but a way of training our ability to experiment and to imagine futures as some sort of futures literacy or circular literacy. Thus, transformative action and research mainly consists of observation, experimentation, reflection, all at the same time. That would be the best way to practice transformation and transformative research. The last part of my very long preamble, sorry, but I think it's sometimes good to make this clear, is that when I'm using the term economy, I would like to propose an ancient definition of economy that was, among others, coined by Aristotle. So far back, who more or less described economy as bundles of practices that maintain the household of a group, of a community, or of a society, and that manages the available resources in a way that preserves the livelihoods of all its members. So that is, now I come to the part about value creation. That is what value creation should mean. Going out from this basic definition, it should answer the question, or it should be measured, value creation, by looking at how well resources are managed and preserved and distributed, right? But if we look of what value is actually generated in value creation, we can see a lot of other things than that. And I need to apologize for my very woodcut-like approach in the next slides, because I'm trying to propose some dominant structures, and I think that's also taken from literature, so I didn't invent them, but but it's a bit a wild gallop through different aspects, how we can see value generation and maybe how we can think different about value generation and value creation. So the first answer I would like to give is by looking at two numbers. Currently, if you want to buy a new TV and you go online shopping, you have the choice between 1,376 different TV models. So almost overwhelming variety and offer that shows me that value creation is a lot about choice, a lot about variation, a lot about affluence, maybe too. But at the same time, more or less at the same time, every German produced an average of 19.4 kilogram of electronic waste in a year. So we have this affluence of products, new products on the one hand, and this huge amount of garbage or waste on the other hand. We have value creation and we have value destruction, kind of, because much of this electronic waste is not in a loop, so we don't use the waste at the end at the moment. And this is something that is a trend, as you all know, that is globally. So even though there is some attention and also political attention towards this problem of e-waste, the amount of e-waste is rising globally, and all the interventions that have been developed and the policies can't really change this trend. So there might be a problem if you take a system perspective between how these different arenas of value creation and value destruction are coupled. So we can't really, we haven't them coupled in a way that makes us able to do something against it. There's only the information that flows that there's a problem, but there's no action, or there aren't the right actions to handle this problem. To put it a bit in simpler terms. And that relates to the logics of value creation. And I'm talking here about the dominant models, not all the variety of different models that are out there, but the dominant ones. And put it in simpler terms, it is mostly based on exchange value. So if we take a mobile phone, for example, the value creation is at its peak when the value is distributed in the market. So a smartphone has the highest value when it's on the shelf. And as soon as it unfolds its value, so it's used, it's put into use, the value is decreasing. So the new phone on the shelf has more value than the phone that is really working for somebody and helping somebody, or unfolding its value, functional value, or use value. And then the value exploitation phase started. In the end, we have the value destruction, and value is zero again. So it's mostly about the monetary value. As I said, the main focus is to distribute the value, and all other phases of the process are kind of shaped or pre-structured or heading towards the distribution. The value creation should be as cheap as possible to make the distribution, the value created out of distribution, as big as possible. The value exploitation should be as short as possible, because then you can get back to the new one as soon as possible. And the value destruction should be as easy as possible, because at the moment the used materials are more expensive than the raw materials. But at the same time, and if you observe it from a systemic perspective, you can see a lot of damage creation alongside the value creation process, and this damage happens a lot in the social sphere and in the ecosphere. So, in terms of smartphones, you start with conflict minerals, for example, that are taken as elements for the smartphone. You have created a lot of mining damage. There are emissions in the production process and the transportation, and toxic electronic waste at the end. So these are just some examples for the types of damage that are created. And the interesting, or another interesting difference is that the value creation just sums up. The damage creation just sums up. So it's not getting to zero again, it's just getting bigger and bigger and more. And these processes of value creation at the one hand and damage creation on the other hand can happen because they are already decoupled in the perception and also in the mechanisms or the ways how we react on these kind of feedbacks that we are getting. So the point is that we shouldn't decouple, we should couple it better. But what is happening in the actual decoupling is that we can separate those spheres, and we have the possibility, or producers, for example, have the possibility to selectively focus some of these aspects without questioning the value creation regimes at the moment. So they, for example, form an alliance to ban conflict minerals, or they try to invest in renewable energies to reduce the emissions in the production, but they're not questioning the value creation regimes on the other hand. And there we have a lot of technological and economic innovation that try to constantly shift the limits of this value creation process and try to change the conditions for it. And this process is not something very new, and is also something that has not recently been decided or designed. It is something. It's the situation that came with a long evolution of how markets, how societies, how technology has co-evolved during a time. And there is this book or different books and observations by Karl Polanyi, who wrote the book Great Transformation in the beginning of the 20th century, but also other books where he described how market societies, how we became or got to be a market society, which means that economy as processes of keeping and maintaining the household of society became the dominant model, and economy and economic exchange process became independent of social relationships. He describes this as a disembedding process, and social processes in turn became dependent on economic expediency. So the idea of a self-regulated economy evolved, and it transformed society as an appendage to the market. So we are kind of depending on economic growth and economic development and progress because our society is embedded into the economy and not the other way around. The other thing is that we have a relation between nature and economy that is shaped like this, that the use of materials at the interface between economy and nature is shaped in favor of economic criteria. So if we increase the value, we increase the use of materials. And it's not the other way around, that the increase of materials can allow us to increase the value, the value creation, but it's formed by the capitalist economic system. So the disembedding is an important thing to consider if we talk about future economic development and the question of how we can re-embed these structures. So the economy is part of society and society is part of nature. And the other aspect that is connected to that is that we have seen or have learned to accept that the industrial mode of production, division of labor, and definition of productive work is what designs our modernity, what designs our civilization and our society. So doing value is pretty much connected to some kind of old definitions on what productive work is. Even though countries like Germany don't have a decreasing amount of industrial production, we still stick to this principle that we have an industrial division of labor and an industrial definition of work and productive work that was created during the Industrial Revolution. So how we are doing value is very important too. Another aspect, I said it's a wide gallop, so excuse me for my jumps. Another aspect is that stories of progress, so how we imagine progress, civilizatory, the evolution of our society and of our civilization is pretty much or deeply connected to the idea that technical development goes along or allows the development of freedom, equality, prosperity, comfort, and emancipation. This is a story, a narrative that has shaped the Industrial Revolution, but it's also shaping how we are looking at digitalization, for example, or Industry 4.0, those new like big mega trends that are also promising for many people that we have more comfort, we have more freedom, we have more prosperity in the future. And this legitimizes the fact that progress measurements are primarily based on economically usable technical developments and monetary indicators. So we have to talk about the narratives and the symbols of value creation. The next thing is that the value chain, the linear value chain logic makes it possible to create value creation regimes that are detached from space and time, from the spaces where the different steps of production and consumption are happening and the times that nature and social and society needs to reproduce in these different parts of the world. It's a bit hard to explain what I mean here, but I recently have heard a speech of a CEO of one of the major smartphone companies, I don't say any names here, who said something like, yeah, we had some problems in South Korea, so we moved to Vietnam, something like that. And that symbolizes this idea that we have the whole world at disposal to create some value chains, and we don't have to really consider the context where production is happening or the ecosphere and the sociosphere of these different places, because we can move everywhere and we can remove our positions over the world. So this is something that makes us able to detach from natural cycles, from social and cultural cycles. So we have a structural recoupling too, the decoupling to the decoupling from practices from the environment. And the next last aspect that I want to highlight is that when we go in a supermarket, we don't really get the feedback that if we look globally, that food, for example, is a scarce scholars throughout the world, that the products are produced by abusing and using natural and social resources. What we see when we go to the supermarket, we see affluence. We see many products, a rapidly changing oversupply of products, and we see that there's always something new. So if I buy a new shampoo, I'm always getting a better version of the version I had before, even though my hair is not getting any better. I still get the impression that, oh, there is such a dynamic innovation in shampoos. And this doesn't show me, and nobody in the supermarket knows the processes that are behind the production of these products. So we don't get the feedback here. We could get the feedback when we do some research, but the supermarket is still there. It shows a totally other picture. So these are just some examples what different aspects of current value regimes are. And I think when we talk about circular society, I'm very interested in talking about ways of doing value. So how value creation regimes are at the moment, and how they can be maybe restructured, or how they can be irritated, so they are more able to react upon the feedback, to react on the feedbacks that we are getting from nature and from measurements of social justice and so on. So the re-embedding is an interesting aspect where we should experiment more in, and structural recoupling. And also how we define value, how we measure value. So what symbols and narratives are we using to define and to define where value is created? And if we go back to the roots of circular economy, what I'm not doing, because Martin did that much better than me, we see that there are a lot of answers when we go back really to the roots, a lot of answers to the questions of recoupling and re-embedding, because they applied an epistemology of complexity that realized that we need to reintegrate complex couplings between nature, society, and technology into the new systems, or during the transformation process, during the experimentation with transformation. And we need to create more loops with integrated feedbacks and couplings. We need to create resilient subsystems, and we need to dematerialize. So the thing is that we need to reconnect biosphere, sociosphere, and technosphere, and not to decouple. We also, and that's what I find really interesting at the moment, is how can we connect to the discourse on sustainable work. There is, since 20, 30, or maybe more years, a lively debate on how we can redefine work, how we can change work policies, and to get a better picture and a more integrated, holistic picture of what work in a society really means, and what different kinds of work we have in the society. But at the moment, if you talk like to common people, that work is something different from leisure. So we talk about work-life balance. So work is something that is not seen as life, which is kind of strange. And I like the idea of some of the proponents of the sustainable work term, like Athletic, for example, who says that we should understand work as something that is not only a means to use nature or to ensure livelihoods and satisfy needs, but also a means to stratify and structure society, organize individual lives. So it has an important meaning. It's not only something that is strenuous or tiring. It's something that is really a basic part of life in society. And they also propose that the work redefining, rearranging how work is done and how work is valued in a society could also help to find new interfaces and couplings between social needs and nature. So the work should be able to connect yourself to nature. It doesn't mean that you have to be a hunter and gatherer again, but it needs to find ways how this connection can be better established. So what I think is part of a circular society is to have a very diverse definition of work, and and have everyday lives that integrate many different activities that are maybe considered as work, but maybe not. Like care work, community work, informal work, to do it together. So playing, also important, relationship work, no work at all. Something like that. So this would be an interesting research and action field. The other thing is that should also be connected, and it is already connected, is the work on social innovation. So the way how the themes that I was describing before are reconfigured in different parts of society, different niches, but also in different new spaces or old spaces, where people find new ways of engaging with materials, of engaging with objects, of engaging with each other. So this is an example picture from a cafe. Sorry that it's only guys, but it's still a nice picture. Some of them said something like, yeah, the other thing is, of course, that you have community again, that people come together again, that they sit together again, that they do something together again. And this is interesting because you would say, why is that so exceptional? But it is exceptional at the moment. So this being together, sitting together, okay, the pandemic situation, it is, of course, something special, but finding a community again, working together in a community, do something together, seems to be an important thing that we should reintegrate in how we define also work. So this is also value that's created here. And the other thing is that we should think about how we can measure other forms of value, all these different forms of value creation, and also connect it to indicators for ecological value creation. So a social ecological value creation indicator system or something like that would be good. And it's not only quantitative indicators, also qualitative ones and dynamic ones that are changing over time. So on each level, on each layer that I'm showing here, we can define maybe different forms of indicators or tools or observation manuals that help us to see what value is created here, what kind of value, and how it adds up to some sort of that we can call a service assignment. So that was a wild gallop. I hope you could follow, and I'm happy to get questions and comments.
Essentially, maybe I should share the screen again. I just want to show the presentation quickly to answer the question, because I think it will help. So here, this is the typology, right, with all different circular discourses. And essentially, there are two circular society discourses here, the reformist and the transformational one. And what I argue in the paper on which this entire typology is based is that essentially one of them remains anthropocentric, and that is the reformist one. Cradle to cradle, natural capitalism, and all the ideas related to it, such as the blue economy and so on, remain within the focus of separating man and nature. And that is why, in great part, they also still have a blind belief, if I might say, on decoupling economic growth from environmental exploitation. They have this idea of substituting natural for other types of capital. Now, on the other hand, on the bottom left, ideas like buen vivir and degrowth and steady-state economics and all the other ideas from the global south that would be within this group are not anthropocentric at all. In fact, they draw inspiration from Buddhist economics and ideas of traditional economies that operated before industrial capitalism and therefore operate under a completely different worldview. So I hope this answers your question.
I'm a big fan of these kind of new possibilities to study something, and I also supervised some theses into these, and I was always very enthusiastic and a big fan of those people because they were looking so broadly at things, and they were so good in contact with themselves and with others. So I think these kind of studies form also persons that are that have this futures literacy and circular literacy and whatever transformative literacy that we need. The interesting question could be how we can bring that out to the world. So it's not like kind of maybe an elite that can study these things, but how can we get it out there? So, for example, yesterday in our Homo Secularis workshop, we discussed, for example, how would car mechanics, how would he learn circular literacy, and what can his role be if he learns something that is maybe not connected to the future economy? And yeah, so, and we also realized in one of the workshops that we're always talking about those people who are left behind, but nobody's here from them. So we should enlarge this kind of discussion and also these kind of offers. That's not easy. I mean, I can say it easily here, but I think it's a big task. And yeah, but maybe it's an idea for the next forum also to have a much broader discussion, not only in transdisciplinary, but also trans-milieu or whatever you would call it.
Well, to be honest, it really depends on what or how you define circular economy, right? If you're thinking of it as an umbrella concept, or rather of circularity as an umbrella concept, as I did, looking at all the related terms and the related literature and the precursors and etc., then obviously the Global South is perhaps right now the richest source of inspiration. We have concepts there like buen vivir. We have radical pluralism from the Zapatistas. We have Ubuntu in Africa. We have ecological Swaraj in India and ecological civilization in China. Also, if you look at circular economy in its current kind of construction, like the actual word circular economy, like the way it's commonly used, and if you look at most of the articles written in Scopus, well, I haven't done this recently, but I think I did this about 2 years ago. So if you look at just the academic production, obviously it's very Eurocentric. So those that use the exact word circular economy are mostly coming from the EU and not all places in the EU, mostly Western Europe, to be honest. And however, the second biggest source is China. And China is producing massively in circular economy. And actually, we have to admit that China is the first real major power that embraced the concept of circular economy in its first 5-year plan. However, they have a very different kind of conception of circular economy than in Europe. And obviously they're guided by a different philosophical background. A lot of circular economy thinking there is also intertwined with Taoist and Confucian philosophy. I'm not saying that all of it is, but a lot of it is. And obviously their goal, their general idea of an ecological civilization, which is actually a communist vision. Obviously it's still a communist state, about circularity in the very long future. So so there's it depends on how you take the concept. And as I said, I think the Global South has a lot of value, especially when you look at other concepts like buen vivir, Ubuntu, ecological Swaraj. They're really, really rich, and I think are not so anthropocentric as a lot of the stuff that we see coming from the global north.
I was more looking on current stereotypical definitions of work and how we can enlarge them. And I think to integrate a holistic picture or a pluriversal picture of work, that would be a step further, I'm sure. And maybe this would be for many people too much to imagine the first step. So I think to have a broader picture of work. For many people, it's not even possible to imagine that there's care work, or that you can't describe care as a work, something. So this is already a big step. But I'm totally with you. I think we should have a definition of work that is a collaboration between people and nature. And I mean, we're also part of the nature, so at least we have been. And I like the approach of a new materialism, for example, who don't make any difference between human actors and actors that are maybe not human or non-human actors. So it's this beyond human perspectives. I like them very much, and I think it would be interesting to define work from this point of view, from this beyond human perspective. So yeah, I'm with you. This could be an interesting thought, and yeah, I think we should. Donna Haraway, I think, is somebody that you know. She describes that we are not even humans. I mean, we are cyborgs, and so, and yeah, we shouldn't have this differentiation between humans and non-humans maybe anymore. So, but yeah, this is maybe for too visionary for many people to imagine. And I'm trying first to talk to politicians to imagine that there's something else that just income generating and paid work. So it's already a big step for them. What I would like to do with circular, with the term circular society and all these ideas is, and not to say that circular economy is wrong, because as I said, and Martin, I think also said that there are a lot of original ideas that are very good, but I think that sometimes people who adopt, and I'm not talking about us, and not talking about everybody, but it's what I can see sometimes in discourses, and particularly in the arena of industry, and when we collaborate with different actors, that they adopt only the parts that they like, and they don't take the whole package, the holistic and systemic view that circular economy provides. And also somebody like Walter Stahel has a pretty much broader picture than many people make beside him. So I think it's important that you should reconsider that. And if we take these roots and the different conceptual aspects that fed into circular economy, then we don't have to talk about circular society, because then everything's fine. Yeah, and I think that's also the problem, that we don't really know what's coming out of the current process, but I think we don't have time to observe it first. So I think it's good, and I like what Andrea Vetter said. We need everything at the moment. So a lot of action and a lot of activity that heads towards a better relation between society and nature, and a better integration of what society is doing with and to nature, and yeah, embed society into nature, embed economy into society, and everybody who's working for that is good. And also circular economy is very good, and the Green New Deal and the European Green Deal is good. But yeah, I think there should be something added, and that's why I think it's good that a lot of people are also adding perspective and adding some ideas for other ways and other experiments that we should undertake. So a lot of action, a lot of irritation is at the moment necessary to change the system, or to make the system transcend itself.
I think I agree exactly on what Melanie was saying. So yeah, I mean, there's good in every kind of discourse type, right? There's a positive aspect to each of them, except perhaps for the bottom right, the fortress circular economy, and that's perhaps also a big thing that we have to keep in mind, is that if we follow, for example, certain discourse or certain vision, but we're not aware of the unintended consequences. So, for example, a technocentric circular economy proposition that focuses on, just industrial ecology and doesn't include very much social elements, could end up bringing us a scenario of a fortress circular future, in which, circular economy innovations are very expensive, limited to the very few, and basically a luxury that only a few countries, and even not only a few countries, but a few people and a few countries can afford. Like electric cars being only available to very few people, and everybody else having not enough good public transport to live. And that's not a future we want. So I think we also have to be more diverse in our way of thinking. So we have to understand that, yes, circular economy has some bits of answers, but if we really want to understand the whole picture and address especially systemic problems, it's not just about including social aspects. It's also about understanding the social and systemic limits of growth, and the necessity to go beyond growth, and therefore beyond the current systemic conditions in which we are. And that requires a more diverse, plural form of thinking that embraces other concepts and ideas, including those of the global south, and many, many, many more. So I think what matters here is diversity, democracy, and pluralism.